Hi, this is Vanessa Salmon, and this is my presentation on my final paper, which was Spirituality of Native Alaskans and um, their connection to all. I open it here with a little quote that I really fell in love with throughout the duration of my research, and it is, "The white people did not teach us anything new. We had already known true religion. We knew about the Great Spirit up in the heaven, even though we did not worship the way we do today." From a Tlingit elder. So, here we go. The Eskimos believe that they are part of the life-giving spirit, that each individual is animated by the life-giving spirit, and that part of his soul, that part of which is the essence of all things, is part of the ultimate deity. So I open with a few questions. How has belief changed over the years, and what is the relationship between the life-giving spirit that I've talked about and Alaska Native people look like now? Is it really fully possible to understand or define or conceptualize Native spirituality? How has colonization changed spiritual practices, and what sort of damage has this incurred? Culture and spirituality have long been conceptualized as the impetus and the effect of an individual's search for meaning. And among Alaska Natives, cultural emphasis on spirituality was once a significant component of oral traditional lifestyle, but colonization pretty much banned most of their spiritual practices, which deprived Alaska Natives not only of their rights to perform religious ceremonies, but it really inflicted incalculable damage on generations because their spiritual identity was pretty much totally denied. So there's this huge gap that's resulted in cultural cohesion, and the loss of core spiritual elements has happened because of acculturation and assimilation, and that is directly related to higher rates of depression, suicide, alcoholism, and sexual and physical abuse among Native people. So the harm that their history has caused is huge, but it's not irreparable. And I think indigenism, communal connection, there's a lot of therapy right now that shows tremendous amount of hope in the way of continued spiritual health among Alaska Native people. Also, acknowledgement of intergenerational trauma, and approaching the emotional scars that have been left is really vital. And looking at all these problems and issues through a strength-based perspective is also critical, I think, in ending the cycles of violence and abuse that are really prevalent in Native culture. So understanding Native Alaskan spiritual and cultural identities is helpful, and it's really necessary for the overall health of Alaska Native peoples and for non-natives alike whose ancestors basically colonized them. So this paper and this presentation basically looks at, well, you can see it there, of the very broad definition of Native spirituality. I explore the history of spirituality as well as the role of shamanism in spirituality, and finally consider the connection between animals, the environment, and spirituality. And ultimately, as I've written here, what's revealed is a really beautiful and dynamic spectrum of spirituality as practiced by Alaska Natives, and it really illuminates a connection to the earth, to the other, and to that life-giving spirit that I think is really worth a lot of thought and ultimately reference. So, defining spirituality as it applies to Native Alaskans is really challenging, even to anthropologists and researchers who study it full time. You can see all these different quotes here about the overall kind of overarching theme that Native spirituality is really, really difficult to describe. I read all kinds of research, and I saw over and over and over again, both in academic articles, in personal interviews, and from my own perspective, talking to people that I've known, that it's really, really difficult to describe exactly what Native spirituality is. And obviously it's different between different groups of Alaska Natives, but that overarching theme is really prevalent in all the research that I read. So for this, I suppose for this presentation and for my research, I kind of went with a fairly broad definition that spirituality refers to the interconnected central component of Native Alaskan culture that addresses experiences and beliefs related to transcendence, shamanism, relationships with the other, and the natural world, and the ways in which individuals discover meaning. And that's really kind of broad. One thing I wanted to introduce here was this idea that Western intellectual tradition is rooted in temporal metaphors, and indigenous people often think inherently in terms of space and not time. So one thing I read was that native spirituality, values, social and political structures, even ethics, are rooted not in some temporal notion of history, but in spatiality. So a native theology based on Alaska Native spiritual experience suggests that God reveals God's self in creation, in space, or in a place, but not necessarily in time. So not chronologically, the way I think we often think of it, but right in front of us. What we hold, the air we breathe, the food we eat, that is all interconnected with that definition. And I found that piece really interesting. It's very difficult for outsiders to understand, and it's really kind of based on this overarching emphasis on individual visionary experiences, which are mystical at their core. And I had a really interesting time trying to delve into what this mysticism was, but it's exactly what it sounds like. And one of the things I loved is that all these academic authors really pointed this out. Pitfalls exist for scholars of comparative mysticism in regards to excavating truths about Native American religions, which are primarily based on diverse and individualized oral tradition. So a lot of what this spirituality encompasses has to do with things that are spoken of. Again, things existing in space and time. Your words exist in space and time. Unless they're written down, you speak them and they're gone. And that's kind of ties right into native spirituality being, existing in space rather than in time. Also, over and over again, as I mentioned, this kind of ineffable, indescribable piece of this. Among the Yupik Eskimos, for example, spirituality is viewed as an integral component of culture, and spiritual development is essential to self-identity. So it's not just this one sort of compartmentalized piece, like you might think of, in westernized culture even. We go to church on Sundays, that's that, and, maybe we read the Bible every morning if we're very fervent, but I feel like overall, reading through all this stuff and doing the research, that it really permeates all of life. It's not just a piece. It's not just a day of the week. So, on to the next slide here. The shamans. This is, as I think we've all read now, because we've all had that spiritual bit in the discussion board. This was huge. Let me find my spot here. So, the shaman was the main religious figure in Native Alaskan society and the only full-time practitioner who had authority and respect in his community. He was not a politician. He was not a scientist. He was not a religious person per se. He was a healer. And I think that additional sources of spiritual power were very intriguing and maybe even attractive to Alaska Native shamans back in the day when colonization was occurring and the missionaries showed up, because they figured, well, hey, what the heck? We can assimilate this into our beliefs and our culture and maybe even heal better. Unfortunately, that did not work out for them at all. They were, as I have written up here, forbidden from speaking their own languages, forbidden from practicing healing. They were hunted, they were shamed, they were shunned and tortured and murdered. But they were the main religious figure in their society. They really freaked out the missionaries. They were thought of as heathens. They were thought of as, people who practiced witchcraft. And they were thought of as extremely ignorant. And they were taken and tortured, and this was by the authority of the church and the military. And so shamanism, which is the practice of working with spirits, is still seen, and it is practiced among the people who live by this law of mystical participation, or the people who are still in touch with that native Alaskan spirituality. And So that mysticism that I was talking about, it's the sense of the spiritual connection that exists between everything and everyone in the universe. And it really plays a large part in modern-day shamanism. It can be viewed as healing or a helping technology, or the technology of the sacred. Mysticism is acts and experiences instead of a set of beliefs or customs. And I think this is really, really key in understanding uh, Native Alaskan spirituality, in that it's not a legalistic set of do's and don'ts. It's not a bunch of commandments. It's a way of thinking about the world that really permeates all of your actions, kind of from the ground up. So it's existential in its philosophical underpinnings, and shamanism today includes visionary and spiritual events. Among the Inuit of northern Alaska in particular, shamanism is evidenced less as a public spectacle and more so in character of events, which often goes unnoticed to people who are, you're not in church falling on the ground speaking in tongues. I guess I could put it that way. These experiences are very, very personal, deeply personal. So a way to understand shamanism is to sense a kind of medium in which all people live that liberates faculties that are beyond the ordinary, a kind of medium that also makes people permeable to one another. So it's not just this connection that kind of pervades life, but it's a connection to one another. And that brings me to the next slide, which is connecting to all. This mystical connection uniting all humans connects all living things, including animals, the natural environment, and the Inuit call this force sila. It's a term that is used to describe the world, the universe, nature, the natural order, common sense, reason, pretty much everything that you can imagine. We are all interconnected. It's this great spirit that guides in Alaska Native spirituality. It compels very deep respect to all manner of life. And just this interesting piece here, throughout hunting and harvest times, because of this sila, this life force that imbues all of life with meaning and respect, ceremonial rites and acts of reciprocity are performed so that the balance and harmony of the world can be maintained in the midst of penetrating and active violence. So we see this and we know this, even as children, we all probably heard and saw the stories of giving thanks to the whale or giving thanks to the fish before you eat it. And this was really beautiful. There's a lot here. And it's a really lovely piece of this. There's this emphasis on a very pure relationship with the environment that's very prevalent among Native Alaskans. Tradition and spiritual belief are historically bound in a web of understanding about the natural world that enabled survival in it. So that brings us kind of to the end. And historically, culture and spirituality have been viewed as the impetus and the effect of any individual's search for meaning. And I think, as evidenced in this presentation, Alaska Natives' emphasis on spirituality was a very significant component of oral and traditions and lifestyles, and colonization really, really changed that. But by examining this broad definition of Native spirituality, exploring spirituality as the role of shamanism in spirituality, and finally considering that connection between all, we see that even through their persecution and assimilation, the spirit of Alaska Natives is one of resilience. And through all their hardship, they really remain connected to the earth, to one another, to that life-giving spirit that has not left them. And they come through these decades of, pain and change, and that sila, that all-encompassing great spirit of connection and life force, is still present, and it's still making itself known in and through the Native people of Alaska. So that's my presentation. There are some references for you, and thank you very much.